Hi guys! Today's lesson is about external economies of scale and international location of production. There are four learning objectives in this lesson, and I hope that by the end of this lesson, you should be able to first, discuss what economies of scale are. Second, describe the types of economies of scale and market structure. Third, articulate the theory of external economy. Hi guys! Today's lesson is about external economies of scale and international location of production. There are four learning objectives in this lesson, and I hope that by the end of this lesson, you should be able to first, discuss what economies of scale are. Second, describe the types of economies of scale and market structure. Third, articulate the theory of external economies. Last, discuss the relationship of external economies and international trade. In the Ricardian model, we pointed out that there are two reasons why countries specialize in trade. First, countries differ either in their resources or technology, hence specialize in the things they do relatively well. Second, economies of scale or increasing returns make it advantageous for each country to specialize in the production of only limited range of goods and services. The analysis of trade based on economies of scale presents certain problems that we have avoided so far. Until now, we have assumed markets are perfectly competitive, so that all monopoly profits are always competed away. When there are increasing returns, however, large firms may have been advantaged over small ones, so that markets tend to be dominated by firms or more often by a few firms. If this happens, our analysis of trade has to take into account the effects of imperfect competition. However, economies of scale need not lead to imperfect competition if they take the form of external economies, which apply at the level of the industry rather than at the level of the individual firm. In this lesson, we will focus on the role of such external economies of scale in trade, reserving the discussion of internal economies for the next lesson. Now, let us start with the introduction of economies of scale. The model of comparative advantage already presented were based on the assumption of constant returns to scale. That is, we assume that if input to an industry were double, industry output would double as well. In practice, however, many industries are characterized by economies of scale, also referred to as increasing returns, so that production is more efficient, the larger the scale at which it takes place. Where there are economies of scale, doubling the input to an industry will more than double the industry production. Mutually beneficial trade can arise as a result of economies of scale. Each country specializes in producing a limited range of products, which enable it to produce this good more efficiently than if it tried to produce everything for itself. These specialized economies then trade with each other to be able to consume the full range of goods and services. This diagram illustrates economies of scale. You can see that unit costs fall from AC1 to AC2 when output increase from Q1 to Q2. That illustrates the effect of economies of scale. So, what are economy of scale? The term itself. Economy of scale refer to the cost advantages that a business can exploit by expanding the scale of production. The effect of economy of scale is to reduce the average unit cost of production. A simple example that can help convey this significance of economy of scale for international trade. This table shows the relationship between input and output of a hypothetical industry. Widgets are produced using only one input, labor. The table shows that how the amount of labor required depends on the number of widgets produced. To produce 10 widgets, for example, requires 15 hours of labor, while to produce 25 widgets requires 30 hours. The presence of economies of scale may be seen from the fact that doubling the input of labor from 15 to 30 more than doubles the industry output. In fact, output increased by a factor of 2.5. Equivalently, the existence of economies of scale may be seen by looking at the average amount of labor used to produce each unit of output. If output is only 5 widgets, the average labor input per widget is 2 hours, while if output is 25 units, the average labor input falls to 1.2 hours. In this example, we represented economy of scale by assuming the labor input per unit of production is smaller when more units produce. This implies that at a given wage rate per hour, the average cost of production falls as output rises. We did not say how this production increase was achieved, whether existing firms simply produced more or whether there was instead an increase in the number of firms. To analyze the effect of economies of scale on market structure, however, one must be clear about what kind of production increase is necessary to reduce average cost. Internal economy of scale occur when the cost per unit depends on the size of an individual firm, but not necessarily on that of the industry. External economies of scale occur when the cost per unit depends on the size of the industry but not necessarily on the size of any one firm. The distinction between internal and external economies can be illustrated with a hypothetical example. Imagine an industry that initially consists of 10 firms, each producing 100 widgets, for a total industry production of 1,000 widgets. Now consider two cases. First, suppose the industry output is held constant at 1,000 widgets, but that the number of firms is cut in half so that each of the remaining 5 firms produce 200 widgets. If the cost of production fall in this case, then there are internal economy of scale. That is, a firm is more efficient when it's able to produce larger output. Second, suppose the industry were to double in size so that it now consists of 20 firms, each one still producing 100 widgets. It is possible that the cost of each firm will fall as a result of the increased size of the industry. For example, a bigger industry may allow more efficient provision of specialized services or machinery. If this is the case, the industry exhibits external economies of scale. That is, the efficiency of firm is increased by having a larger industry even though each firm is the same size as before. External and internal economy of scale have different implications for the structure of industry. An industry where economy of scale are purely external, that is, where there are no advantages to large firms, will typically consist of many small firms and be perfectly competitive. Internal economy of scale, by contrast, give large firms a cost advantage over small firms and lead to an imperfectly competitive market structure. Both external and internal economies of scale are important causes of international trade because they have different implications for market structure. However, it is difficult to discuss both types of scale economy based trade in the same model. We will therefore deal with them one at a time. In this lesson, we focus on external economies. In the next lesson, on internal economies. As we have already pointed out, not all scale economies applied at the level of the individual firm. For a variety of reasons, it is often the case that concentrating production of an industry in one or a few locations reduce the industry cost even if the individual firms in the industry remain small. When economy of scale apply at the level of the industry rather than at the level of individual firm, they are called external economies. There are many modern examples of industry where there seem to be powerful external economies. In the United States, these examples include the semiconductor industry, concentrated in California's famous Silicon Valley, the investment banking industry, concentrated in New York, and the entertainment industry, concentrated in Hollywood. In the rising manufacturing industry of developing countries such as China, external economies are pervasive. For example, one town in China accounts for a large share of the world underwear production. Another produced nearly all of the world's cigarette lighters. Yet another produced a third of the world's magnetic tap heads, and so on. External economy have also played a key role in India's emergence as a major exporter of information services, which a large part of this industry still cluster in and around the city of Bangalore. External economies may exist for a few reasons. In many industries, the production of goods and services, and to an even greater extent, the development of new products, require the use of specialized equipment and support services. Yet, an individual company does not provide a large enough market for these services to keep the suppliers in business. A localized industry cluster can solve this problem by bringing together many firms that collectively provide a large enough market to provide or support a wide range of specialized suppliers. For example, Silicon Valley in California has a large concentration of silicon chips company, which are serviced by companies that make special machines for manufacturing silicon chips. These machines are cheaper and more easily available there than elsewhere. A second source of external economies is the way that a cluster of firms can create a pool market for workers with highly specialized skills. Such a pool market is to the advantage of both the producer and the workers, as the producers are less likely to suffer from labor shortages and the workers are less likely to become unemployed. It is by now a cliche that in the modern economy, knowledge is at least as important an input as are factors of production like labor, capital, and raw materials. This is especially true in highly innovative industry where being even a few months behind the cutting edge in production techniques or product design can put a company at a major disadvantage. But where does the specialized knowledge that is crucial to success in innovative industry come from? Companies can acquire technology through their own research and development effort. They can also try to learn from competitors by studying their products and in some cases by taking them apart to reverse engineer their design and manufacture. An important source of technical know-how, however, is the informal exchange of information ideas that take place at a personal level. And this kind of informal diffusion of knowledge often seems to take place most effectively when an industry is concentrated in a small area so that employees of different companies mix socially and talk freely about technical issues. As we have just seen, a geographically concentrated industry is able to support specialized suppliers, provide a pool labor market, and facilitated knowledge spillover in a way that a geographically dispersed industry cannot. But the strength of this economy presumably depends on the industry's size. Other things equal, a bigger industry will generate stronger external economies. So, what does this say about the determination of output and prices? Imagine for a moment we live in a world in which it is impossible to trade buttons across national borders. Assume also there are two countries in this world, China and the United States. Finally, assume button production is subject to external economies of scale, which lead to a forward falling supply curve for buttons in each country. In that case, equilibrium in the world button industry will look like the situation shown in this figure. In both China and the United States, equilibrium prices and output would be at the point where the domestic supply curve intersect the domestic demand curve. In the case shown in this figure, Chinese button prices in the absence of trade would be lower than US button prices. Now, suppose we open up the potential for trade in buttons. What will happen? It seems clear that the Chinese button industry will expand, while the US button industry will contract, and this process will feed on itself. As the Chinese industry output rises, its cost will fall further. As the US industry output falls, its cost will rise. In the end, we can expect all button production to be concentrated in China. The effects of this concentration are illustrated in this figure. Before the opening of trade, China supplied only its own domestic button market. After trade, it supplies the world market, producing button for both China and US consumer. Notice the effect of this concentration of production on prices. Because China's supply curve is forward falling, increased production as a result of trade leads to a bottom price that is lower than the price before trade. And bear in mind that Chinese bottom prices were lower than American bottom prices even before trade. What this tells us is that trade leads to bottom prices that are lower than prices in either country before trade. In our example of world trade in buttons, we simply assume the Chinese industry started out with lower production costs than the American industry. So, what might lead to such an initial advantage? One possibility is comparative advantage, that is, the underlying differences in technology and resources. For example, there is a good reason why Silicon Valley is in California rather than in Mexico. High technology industry require a highly skilled workforce, and such a workforce is much easier to find in the United States, where 40% of the working age population is college educated, than in Mexico, where the number is below 16%. Similarly, there are a good reason why world button production is concentrated in China rather than in Germany. Button production is a labor-intensive industry, which is best conducted in a country where the average manufacturing worker earns less than $1 an hour rather than in a country where hourly compensation is among the highest in the world. However, in industry characterized by external economies of scale, comparative advantage usually provides only a partial explanation of the pattern of trade. It was probably inevitable that most of the world's button would be made in a relatively low-wage country, but it's not clear that this country necessarily had to be China, and it certainly wasn't necessary that production be concentrated in any particular location within China. So, what does determine the pattern of specialization and trade in industry with external economies of scale? The answer often is historical contingency. Something give a particular location an initial advantage or pioneer advantage in a particular industry, and this advantage gets locked in by external economies of scale even after the situation that created the initial advantage are no longer relevant or available. The financial centers in London and New York are clear examples. London became Europe's dominant financial center in the 19th century, when Britain was the world leading economy and the center of a world-spanning empire. However, it has retained that role even though the empire is long gone and modern Britain is only a middle-sized economic power. New York became America's financial center thanks to Erie Canal, which made it the nation's leading port. It has retained that role even though the canal currently is used mainly by recreational boats. One consequences of the role of history in determining industrial location is that industries aren't always located in the right place. Once a country has established an advantage in an industry, it may retain that advantage even if some other country could potentially produce the good more cheaply. This figure, which shows the cost of producing button as a function of the number of buttons produced annually, illustrated this point. Two countries are shown, China and Vietnam. The Chinese cost of producing a button is shown as AC China, the Vietnamese cost as AC Vietnam. D will represent the world demand for buttons, which we assume can be satisfied either by China or by Vietnam. Suppose the economies of scale in button production are entirely external to firms. Since there are no economy of scale at the level of the firm, the button industry in each country consists of many small, perfectly competitive firms. Competition therefore drives the price of button down to its average cost. We assume the Vietnamese cost curve lies below the Chinese curve because, say, Vietnamese wages are lower than Chinese wages. This means that at any given level of production, Vietnam could manufacture buttons more cheaply than China. One might hope that this would always imply that Vietnam will in fact supply the world market. Unfortunately, this need not be the case. Suppose China, for historical reason, establishes its button industry first. Then initially, world button equilibrium will be established at point 1 in this figure, with Chinese production of Q1 units per year and a price of P1. Now, introduce the possibility of Vietnamese production. If Vietnam could take over the world market, the equilibrium will move to point 2. However, there is no initial Vietnamese production, that is, Q equal to 0. Any individual Vietnamese firm considering manufacture of buttons will face a cost of production of C0. As we have drawn it, this cost is above the price at which the established Chinese industry can produce buttons. So, although the Vietnamese industry could potentially make buttons more cheaply than China industry, China head start enabled it to hold on to the industry. As this example show, external economy potentially give a strong role to historical accidents in determining who produce what and may allow established patterns of specialization to persist even when they run counter to comparative advantage. In summary, trade need not be the result of comparative advantage. Instead, it can result from increasing returns or economy of scale, that is, from a tendency of unit cost to be lower with larger output. Economy of scale give countries an incentive to specialize and trade, even in the absence of differences in resources or technology between countries. Economy of scale can be internal, which depending on the size of the firm, or external, which depending on the size of the industry. Economy of scale can lead to a breakdown of perfect competition unless they take the form of external economies which occur at the level of the industry instead of the firm. External economies give an important role to history and accident in determining the pattern of international trade. When external, when external economies are important, a country starting with large advantage may retain that advantage even if another country could potentially produce the same goods more cheaply. Recall back the example of China and Vietnam button industry. When external economies are important, countries can conceivably lose from trade. So, that's all for today's lesson and see you in the next lesson. Thank you and bye bye.